American Spirits episode 29. And today we're going to be concluding our series on Mencken with a discussion of H.L. Mencken on Nietzsche, actually. So let me make sure the stream's running before I introduce you guys. As we were just doing the Warhammer setup a second ago, this is very professional. My phone is now my phone is crashing. Okay, yeah, we're good. So yeah, I'm joined by Ryan Turnipseed, of course, as usual, and then we've got special guest this time, Mr. Cameron from the Lewis and Clark Society, who wanted to do this. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to do this episode. Big fan of American Spirits. um, big Nietzsche guy. I wouldn't call myself a Nietzschean. I've kind of evolved past him in some respects, but I still really respect him. So I'm excited to do this.
Cool. All right. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little flustered here just because I have a different streaming setup. Inevitably, unable to fix my issue with my Yeti microphone, so I think it's time just to retire it on desktop and switch to like one of these new Shure microphones or something. Anyway, so yeah, HL Mencken on Nietzsche. We've got a lot of screenshots queued up. Uh, well, you brought up this topic as one to discuss, actually, Cameron. That is Nietzsche, and given that H.L. Mencken has a book on Nietzsche in particular, it was suggested that we actually do that one. So, do you want to give an introduction to maybe why you wanted to talk about this topic in particular on American
Just
spirits? After all, he's a European philosopher, of course, an American writer. Will be the context in which we discuss it. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, sure. I mean, he's definitely a European philosopher, but he is kind of the other half of the modern right, dissident right, whatever you want to call this movement. He's kind of the other half of it. Obviously, you have like the BAP sphere. You have people like Uberboyo. He's an Irish guy, but and then there's the neo-pagan scene, even in America, who definitely would subscribe to kind of Nietzschean ideas. So I really think it's important to talk about these. I also think, I mean, Nietzsche, personally, I still think Nietzsche is one of the best philosophers of all time. Even if I have come to disagree with him in some ways, I still think he's pretty, pretty on point in many respects. And really, I think that for the Christian right or, cultural Christian right, whatever that may be, you need to be able to understand Nietzsche's ideas and maybe have critiques of them or have a deep understanding of them in order to, you know, argue against people you disagree with or just have a better, more respectful relationship with neo-pagans or Nietzschean types or whatever. So I think it's important that we discuss this guy. And I mean, I have never read this book, The Philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, before it was brought up to me. And after reading it, it was a fantastic text. And I actually kind of saw how Mencken could synthesize Nietzschean thought with kind of his, I don't want to call him like a progressive because there's a lot of baggage with that term, but in some respect, he subscribed to aspects of social progress of like the 19th and 20th century. And showing how that in early American history related to Nietzsche, I think is interesting. And I think it's relevant to bring up, especially since what happened to Nietzsche as a philosopher actually really reflects what happened to kind of Western thinking in general, because really before World War II, Nietzsche was kind of just like a progressive, rule-breaking philosopher that like is this representative of the vital, powerful West. He's a person who's smashing all the barriers and bringing humanity into a new age, past Christianity, blah 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 blah. And then after World War II, maybe when the West is exhausted, it's doubtful of itself. Oh my gosh. Sorry, my screen turned off for a second. The West is doubtful of itself to an extent. You have Nietzsche being turned first into a villain because National Socialist Germany took Nietzsche and kind of turned him into a propaganda figure. But also he kind of got tied into postmodernism, into nihilism, into a deep critique of the West, a deep self-doubt of the West. So overall, he's kind of a philosopher that is a perfect representative of Western civilization's experience from the early to mid 20th century. So that's like another reason why I think he's worthwhile. Sorry if I'm rambling, but I think those are kind of my points.
No, that seems pretty good. So before we jump in as well, regarding the right in particular, you mentioned a few groups. I think that people in the audience might have various connotations with the groups that you mentioned. Is it just that you can read this to understand those groups, the people who particularly follow BAP, neo-pagans, or what have you, or is there are there other lessons to be learned in this as well beyond just mutual understanding?
I mean, yeah, like for example, I think Nietzsche's views on art are universal, even if you're a Christian or a pagan. His Dionysian Apollonian dialectic. I know it sounds big words and all that. Basically, how he views kind of a tension within art between two different types of art, I think is extremely important. If you want to be an artist or understand art at a deeper level, I think that's valid. I think Nietzsche's views on women are pretty true, as we'll see later. So it's good to hear those. As a Christian, and I think a lot of people in the OGC are Christians, having an understanding of one of the most powerful critiques of Christianity is incredibly important. If you're going to hold to your faith and be able to defend yourself, I think that's also important. On top of that, I mean, really, Nietzsche is a pretty abrasive figure for Christians. So, maybe hearing his ideas, I'd hope that, your faith is strong enough to hold against it. I believe for most people it is, but, maybe some of these ideas can help keep you creative and inspired.
Yes,
right.
Nietzsche's certainly one of the great Western philosophers, and his critiques of Christianity absolutely cannot be ignored. As for my own experience with him, for the purposes of the stream, it's been a long time since I've read Nietzsche, over 5 years for sure, maybe more like 7. But I've read the Genealogy of Morals, which certainly stands out the most, in my opinion, among his work, Beyond Good and Evil, and 2 other essays in one of the basic writings of Nietzsche collections, translated
Yes,
by
yeah.
Kaufman. So if you know that one, I've read that book and everything in there. So that's
Yeah,
kind of my
I can see
familiarity
it.
with
I
him.
can see it from my chair. It's hanging on my shelf right there. Yeah.
Cool. So why don't we go ahead and get into it? Do you have any particular screenshot you want me to bring up to tee off the
Well,
discussion?
so I will just say I kind of messed up a little bit. I didn't start taking screenshots till like page 30 because I wasn't
That's
sure how
fine.
this works. So I just want to start real quick with kind of a basic rundown of Nietzsche's early life, because it's pretty important to understand his early life because it might let you understand how he developed some of his ideas. So Nietzsche was born in a village in Saxony, which is a province of Germany, called Rücken. It's a very small town. He's buried there today. There's like a really weird postmodern graveyard where you can see his body. He was born there. His family was a family of Lutheran pastors, 5, 6, 7 generations back, all the way back to like Martin Luther's time. I mean, Wittenberg is in Saxony, I believe, so that's not really surprising. His father died when he was pretty young, and that definitely had a big influence on his life. He was really raised by women. He was raised by his mom, his aunt, and his sister. So that had a big influence on his life, obviously. This is kind of just an interesting thing to bring up. And I think it says a lot about him as a person. He hated being German. And he hated Germany because he thought it was cultureless and in a primitive society. And he actually thought he was Polish. And I just want to get this out of the way because it's kind of a funny thing and it's important. It's kind of important context to show that he's way more complicated than people think. He's not like Hitler's top guy. He's not a nationalist. He's not a Prussian patriot. And he's really a complex guy. He argued his entire life that he was actually Polish. Well, up into his 20s, until the day he died. He actually argued he was Polish. He argued that his real last name was Nietzsche, which is not real. Some German genealogists looked into his family background, and he is 100% German. But he did that because he hated Germany and German culture and society. And really, I think a lot of that is also he hated just his own background as a family of pastors, and he wanted to distance himself from that. He claimed he was descended from Polish nobility. And this is also why he wasn't a German nationalist, for a variety of other reasons, but especially that. He went to school in I think Bonn, which I think is in southern Germany, if I'm not mistaken. And then he went to a gymnasium in I think actually the gymnasium was in Bonn, if I remember correctly. And a gymnasium in the 1800s is basically a college prep school. There, he was known as a really smart guy. He was just really stubborn, and he was really bad at math, very much like me in school, in public school. And then he went to Basel in Switzerland to study philology. Philology is kind of a forgotten science. It's the science of the history of literature, and kind of the context of when a piece of literature was written, who wrote it, when, why, etc. Kind of exploring the the context of a piece of literature, basically. He studied that. He fought in the Franco-Prussian War as a medical aide. He became one of the youngest professors in the history of Europe at age 24. He was a tenured professor at Basel University in philology, which really shows how intelligent he was. And that's kind of a basics of his background. I just wanted to bring that all up because it's mentioned in the book, and I forgot to take screenshots. And yeah, so now we can start with screenshots if you want.
Excellent. Yeah, very good introduction. I was not aware of much of that myself, so I'm sure the audience found that useful.
So are we on the first one?
Yes.
Sure.
And,
if we're
so
going directly in order, then I will hit the transition button. There we go. It's now on screen.
Right. So why don't you before
Sorry,
we
go ahead,
read
Ryan.
out before we read out this this excerpt, why don't you tell us how this is structured? Because we're kind of jumping straight into ideas, if I understand correctly.
Yeah. So are you referring to Mencken's text? How it's structured?
At least the excerpts that you have, like it looks
Sure.
like we're about to jump into tragedy, philology of the Greek language and ideas and whatnot. So now that we have the background out of the way, if you can give us an overview of the ideas.
So with that background in mind, I can kind of just start with actually something I learned from this book, which I'm very happy about. I was already familiar with The Birth of Tragedy. It's Nietzsche's first book, written, I believe, in the late 1860s or early 1870s, something like that. And it was actually written upon the request of Richard Wagner. So Richard Wagner is an incredibly famous German composer. He is the German composer of the 19th century. I'm sure many people here have listened to his music. He was very good friends with Nietzsche for years. They became enemies later, but we'll probably talk about that way later in this stream. But basically, Nietzsche and Wagner hit it off really well, became good friends, and Nietzsche wanted to explore kind of a dialectic he noticed in Greek tragedy, and really he wanted to answer the question of why do the Greeks write tragedies when they live in such a beautiful place? You know, if you've ever seen Greece, it's beautiful, 70 degrees all year round, beautiful oceans, clear skies. Why would they write these stories that are so tragic and kind of filled with schadenfreude and semi-nihilistic themes? You know, why would they write these things? And he told Wagner that, and Wagner's like, you need to write a book about why that is. And so that's what Nietzsche did. And he wrote this while he was teaching at Basel. And before we get into the book, I'll just say, I love this book. I've read it once. It's a very complicated book. I would not recommend you read Nietzsche in chronological order because this book is very complicated. It's basically a philology paper essay from the 1860s. So good luck reading that and understanding what he's trying to say. I'd say I understood about half of what he was trying to say there, but he published it and it got thrashed by philology experts of the time. And today there's a lot of modern scholars who really question a lot of the historical accuracy of the ideas here. I think some of the ideas are probably a bit inflated, but overall I would say a lot of it is in broad strokes correct. And, you know, I'm kind of a casual artist. I'm a writer in my personal life. I write certain things. I'm getting into piano. I do certain bits of physical art. And, as a person who experiments in the arts, I can totally see what Nietzsche's getting at here. So, with that in mind, that's kind of what we're diving into now, is kind of trying to answer, why did the Greeks write tragedy? And just from that one thing, we're going to learn a lot about how Nietzsche viewed art in general.
All right. So should I read out the section that you have outlined here, or how would you like to do this?
I'm just gonna read it out just because
Okay.
it'll help me. It'll help me remember why I highlighted it.
Sure. All right.
So here we go. So when Nietzsche had worked out his theory of Greek tragedy and of Greek life, he set out at once to apply it to modern civilization, to see if it could explain certain ideas of present as satisfactorily as it had explained one great idea of the past. He found that it could, that men were still torn between the Apollonian impulse to conform and moralize and the Dionysian impulse to exploit and explore. He found that all mankind might be divided into two classes, the Apollonians, who stood for permanence, and the Dionysians, who stood for change. It was the aim of the former to live in strict obedience to certain invariable rules, which found expression as religion, law, and morality. It was the aim of the latter to live under the most favorable conditions possible, to adapt themselves to changing circumstances, and to avoid the snares of artificial permanent rules. So that quote sounds kind of abstract, but really I think that's a good introduction to what Nietzsche found. When he had worked out a theory of Greek tragedy, he had found that there were two types of art, two types of impulses, you could say, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And at a fundamental level, it's very abstract. There are a lot of different definitions for these two things, but really, you could describe it as the Apollonian is kind of a solid, static reflection of the world, of kind of understandable principles, laws, and morals that's quantifiable and easily explainable using logic, or self-interest, stuff like that. And then the Dionysian is really kind of chaotic, kind of wild, barbarian, tribal, indiscernible things, like really like music, just raw music, like flutes, drums, like something a satyr would play, like all of that kind of stuff is kind of wild, and it's hard to explain why is that so alluring. And drama is also a form of Dionysian art. It's something that's chaotic, nihilistic, entropic, hard to quantify as a good, but we're so drawn towards it, because everyone likes to gossip and everyone loves a good drama movie or whatever, something like that. And then dance is also a form of Dionysian art. And that's kind of the dialectic that Nietzsche discovered as he explored these things. So we can kind of move on to the next quote.
Just
oh, yeah.
Actually, never
Sure,
mind.
go
I'll
ahead.
save my question.
No. Actually, I want to hear your question. It's okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, does this extend beyond art? Could you apply this to other non-artistic fields as well, or would that be misinterpreting what Nietzsche was trying to speak to here?
So, well, the Nietzsche of the time probably would have not done that, but I think you can, and I think Nietzsche himself did, because as Nietzsche aged and his philosophy evolved over time, we saw him start to reference Dionysus more and more and more and more, and he actually christened himself Dionysus. That's when he was going crazy, and we can get into that later. There's a lot of fake stuff there. Oh, sorry. Am I like bumping it? I'm like I touch the table and I swing my arms around. Is this better? Does this sound fine? Okay, but oh yeah, we can talk about that later. But Nietzsche kind of identified everything he didn't like as Apollonian. Christianity is inherently Apollonian to him. And then Nietzsche would not be a neo-pagan. I'm just going to say that. That's probably going to ruffle some feathers, but he would have laughed at neo-pagans and thought they were absurd. But you can kind of call like a very vague, like Greek pagan soul is what Nietzsche was aiming for instead of actually becoming a neo-pagan. He would describe all of that as Dionysian. And really, any form of pre-Socratic philosophy he would describe as Dionysian. So you can kind of apply this to politics as well. If you guys know Mike from Imperium Press, which I'm sure you guys know him,
Yeah.
he has a concept. He has a concept of like Odinic and Tyrrhic, and he describes it as like the Odinic is something that causes huge change and throws the rules out the window and applies force and power to rule. That's kind of Dionysian. And then the Tyrrhic is like preserving the order built by the Odinic, built by people who want to change the world, preserving that, keeping it running forever for centuries and centuries until another Odinic person comes along. That's kind of an Apollonian. So you can apply it to those things as well.
All right, very good.
Yeah. But so that's kind of what Nietzsche has discovered so far. And this is kind of the core part of his first book, The Birth of Tragedy. So let's move on to quote number 2. Whoops. Let's see. Okay, yes. So this quote kind of expands upon what Nietzsche was doing. So as a philologist, which is a person who kind of breaks down literature, or who, why, where, etc., of like why the literature exists, Nietzsche's interest very naturally was fixed upon the literature of Greece and Rome. And so it was but natural that his first test of sober doctrines made in that field. Sometimes before this, he had asked, and this is kind of what I was referring to earlier, why is it that the ancient Greeks, who were an efficient and vigorous people living in a green and sunny land, should so delight in gloomy tragedies? One would fancy that a Greek, when he had set out to spend a pleasant afternoon, would seek entertainment that was frivolous and gay. But instead, he often preferred to see one of the plays of Thespis, Asacius, Phrynichus, or Pratinus, in which the heroes fought hopeless battles of fate and died miserably in wretchedness and despair. Nietzsche concluded that the Greeks had this liking for tragedy because it seemed to them to set forth truthfully and understandably the conditions of life as they found it, that it appeared to them as reasonable and an accurate picture of human existence. The gods ordered the drama on the real stage of the world. The dramatists ordered the drama on the mimic stage of the theater. And the latter attained credibility and verisimilitude in proportion as it approached an exact imitation or reproduction of the former. Nietzsche saw that this quality of realism was the essence of all stage plays. Only insofar as the dramatist, he said, coalesces with the primordial dramatist of the world does he reach the true function of his craft. Man posits himself as the standard. A race cannot do otherwise than acquiesce in itself. In other words, man was interested in nothing whatever that has no bearing upon his own fate. He himself is his own hero. Thus, the ancient Greeks were fond of tragedy because it reflected their life in miniature. In the mighty warriors who stalked the boards and defied the gods, each Greek recognized himself. In the conflicts on the stage, he saw replicas of that titanic conflict, which seemed to him to be internal essence of human existence. So, what does all of that mean? Basically, what Nietzsche identified is that Greek tragedy was a reflection of the Greek experience. It was an expression of how the Greeks saw reality itself. And when we consider that, kind of what we get at is, well, we notice that Apollo and Dionysus are both Greek gods. And they're Greek gods that balance one another and relate to one another deeply. And what Nietzsche discovered at the end of all of this is the Greeks and their tragedy is a reflection of Greek life. And Greek life is a mixture of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And his final kind of diagnosis for all of this is that Greek civilization, which he considered the best in the world, and I think a lot of people would agree that ancient Greece was one of the highest civilizations to ever exist. It was so great, and it had so much vitality and such great tragedies and art. And we don't really know much of their music, but what little music they had was probably pretty good as well. All of it was so good and so enjoyed by us today because they were able to mix the Dionysian and Apollonian together. And Mencken actually mentions this. I believe I forgot to quote this part. Yeah, I did by accident. But basically, what Mencken identified Nietzsche saying is that the Greeks started out as Dionysian. The Greeks are Indo-European invaders that invaded the Greek peninsula thousands of years ago. They did the Helen of Troy thing, they did the Mycenaean age and all the little city-states and all that. And they were very Dionysian, and they became Apollonian over time. They adopted more civilized, language-based systems. And then over time, they kind of became stale. But unlike most civilizations who become stale and then collapse, the Greeks managed to somehow insert some barbarian back into themselves. And we don't really know how they did this. Maybe some barbarians invaded Greece and integrated with the Greek people. Maybe they just kind of noticed, like, hey, we need a barbaric side, so let's go back to our ancestors and readopt this barbarism. However they did it, we don't know. But overall, Nietzsche identified this trend and then realized, oh, this is how the Greeks mix Apollonian and Dionysian together and make great art.
Right. And what is that trend exactly?
The trend? Sorry?
Yeah. How would you identify this barbarism? What is that? When did it occur in their culture?
So Mencken specifically, I actually have some. Nietzsche didn't really say where Mencken mentioned this exactly. He kind of alluded to it. The borders of Greece were filled with barbarians, Thracians, Macedonians, which were basically barbarians, even though they considered themselves Greek. Like the Illyrians were there. Other very barbaric peoples bordered Greece. And Greeks may have interacted with them, taken them back in. And what that would look like is, seeing a bunch of barbarians just dance wildly, drunk out of their minds around a fire. Like, that's an example. Like, why do people do that, right? That's craziness. But it's something that barbarians do all the time. It's raiding other people's villages and kidnapping their wives. It's it's telling great tales of your warrior ancestors in great deeds. Specifically what it isn't, and this is really important, is it's not this deep contemplation. It's not this platonic denial of reality, as in there's a world of the perfect forms out there that's better than this world. It's not thinking about philosophy all day. It's living in the world and getting drunk and fighting people and being a barbarian, if you want to put it that way. It's kind of abstract, but just imagine like a Greek guy who's, reading scrolls and contemplating the nature of the universe, interacting with a Thracian barbarian on horseback who can't read and, gets drunk and raids villages all day. It's basically that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because normally barbarian neighbors like that are a serious problem for a civilization, but somehow in this case, the Greeks, their own civilization thrived by having this barbarian element. I guess inside of it, these people were also all Greeks, so you had these civilized city-states, and then you had the barbarian city-states as well, like Macedonia or Thrace or whatever. They weren't like outsider barbarians, they were insider barbarians in a sense.
Yeah, and one thing I will note about that is, of course, Macedonia conquered Greece, but I will say that Greek culture collapsed, basically, so that's not really a good example. Another thing I do want to note is that Thracians were actually very common mercenaries in Greece, all over Greece. Like, every city-state hired Thracian mercenaries. So that could have been a big reason why this barbaric return to older, more primitive forms of culture came about in Greece.
Now, one more question. Well, actually, you go ahead, Turnip. I don't want to monopolize.
I was just going to say that's fascinating, because that kind of runs against the popular right-wing meme that if you have outsider mercenaries all over the place, it will destroy your civilization. You seem to be saying it could also potentially lead to a different sort of like a revitalization.
Oh, yeah. The Greeks hired the Thracians, but of course they still had their very thick walled city-states and still had a strong culture to handle these mercenaries. So I guess you can kind of say, like, that's true. Yeah, if you bring in too many mercenaries, it might destroy your culture, but only if your culture is very weak. If you have a very strong culture already, that might be declining slightly and slowly. You can take in some mercenaries and maybe get revitalized a little bit. So I think I think there's kind of a balance there that we should consider.
Now, I've read writers. I don't know if you've read Camille Paglia's book Sexual Persona, which also goes into these aspects of the Dionysian and Apollonian, and some modern contemporaries apply these aspects to the self as well. People have Apollonian and Dionysian aspects. Would Nietzsche use these terminologies like that himself, or were they more confined to the Greeks?
In respect to any civilization, is what you said? Sorry.
In respect to an individual person having these aspects within them.
Oh, certainly. I would say so. I mean, it's definitely like a civilizational thing, but I mean, an individual can be Dionysian, like, you know, some
Right.
guy who lives in Scandinavia who does Eurobeat parties and is a neo-pagan Viking bodybuilder. He's kind of Dionysian, whereas like someone like me, I'm a little more Apollonian. I'm just reading books all day and, you know,
I
working
agree
a
in my
job and stuff like that.
self-conception. The as far as being more Apollonian, I guess my follow-up question where I was leading is it actually appropriate to take these two Greek gods and what they represented and use them as dichotomies within our own culture? Because you mentioned Imperium Press uses this Odinic Tyrrhic dichotomy instead, which is similar but not entirely the same thing. So is it even entirely appropriate to sort of confiscate this thing from the Greeks and apply it to ourselves? You know, we're sort of in a lineage of civilizations coming from them, so maybe it makes some sort of sense. But is it, I guess, universally applicable, or is it something inherent to Greek civilization and perhaps their successors?
So I would say it applies pretty well to the West. I would say that. I mean, as you've just said, I mean, maybe Spengler disagrees. I know he thinks we're not heirs of Greek civilization, but to an extent we are. And I really think, at least in the arts, I would say in the arts, this very much applies. It'll always apply in any forms of art, even around the world, but especially in the West. And in the West, I mean, I would kind of describe like Western civilization in general to be fairly Dionysian, um, in the sense of like always changing, always pursuing kind of a senseless, boundless conquest of knowledge and kind of being anti-conservative. You know,
Right.
you can call obviously that's like Faustian, as Spengler would say. And these are pretty loose comparisons. And honestly, I think Spengler is probably a better source of such comparisons. Like, you know, we're a Faustian civilization that's pushing forward forever. And we've maybe more abandoned the Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy in many respects. But in respect to the arts, I would say it's still completely appropriate.
And to the actual author of the book here, H.L. Mencken, I think that this sort of sheds a great light on him, where he manages to mix this in ways perhaps that aren't immediately obvious. Unless I missed something when I was reading, I don't think Nietzsche anticipated this. If you look at H.L. Mencken's character in Politics, which we have been going through for the past month or so on this series, and the famous label that he termed himself the Tory anarchist, he seems to be trying to synthesize the two strands here. He is a complete radical. If you go back and listen to when we read his essays on like crime and punishment or hanging a man or what have you, he is very much in favor of a much more radical, a change from the current direction of things into, you know, just killing people more legally, of course, with the law. So in that sense, he's trying to uproot and subvert the current order, the much more moralistic and progressive order that was taking root at the time. But if you look at the way he argues for things, it's always in terms of how things were always done. The appeal is always to like a much older law or common sense as it was understood before the era that he was in. So, is it possible to synthesize these? Is this a fundamental contradiction?
As in, like he comes back to the eternal principles, and then calls himself a Tory anarchist. Is that kind of what you mean?
I guess what I'm getting at, Tory anarchist, Tory obviously being much more in this Apollonian strain, just by the actual
definitely, yeah.
name of the word. Anarchist being in the other strain. And if you once again, if you look at what he does, he's always almost blasphemously arguing for reverting back to how things were supposed to be. So it seems to be like a not necessarily a blend of the two strands here, but an actual synthesis of the two. Or is that
I would kind of
shallow?
like, I mean, just thinking about it, I would say what he's getting at is kind of like maybe like the bare level of moral foundation that like every barbarian tribe even had. I mean, because every barbarian tribe, had some, at least in, the West, had a respect for heterosexuality and a patriarchal society, and just like you can call them, maybe you can even call it like will to power moral virtues, which is a kind of contradictory statement, but basically a power based, a strength based, common sense moral system of like, yeah, I'm powerful and I rule and I can take what I want, but I also have to like, have a family. I need to keep the tribe together. I need to keep it stable. Obviously, like Mencken never wrote about like forming a Bronze Age war band or anything, but I think maybe what he's getting at is something like there's these, ancient principles that every society is going to have to follow at the end of the day, but I want to tear as much down as possible and get back to that. I don't know completely because I'm a little bit behind on certain American spirit things, but I'd have to see.
Well, certainly the synthesis is exactly what worked for the Greeks, right? Is that they were able to synthesize these two things, which is different than just having both.
Yeah, and Mencken kind of puts it as like, he puts it really succinctly. This is one of the best descriptions of Apollonian Dionysian I've ever seen. He puts it as the Apollonian is kind of a reflection of reality and like a respect for reality in the physical world. So like imagine like carving a flower out of limestone, right? And then having a statue of a flower. That's Apollonian. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but we're not doing anything to reality. We're just respecting it. We're holding it all together. And then the Dionysian is like, well, actually, I'm going to tear that flower out of the ground, eat it. Oh, and it's an aphrodisiac, and now I'm high out of my mind or whatever, right? It's taking reality and experiencing it and changing it. And the Greeks managed to bring those things together. And pretty broad and abstract stuff. But at the time, this book was kind of a bombshell. A lot of people liked it back then. And a lot of modern artists, people who never read Nietzsche, will read this book and say, this is awesome. This is what art is. Bring Dionysus and Apollo together. So, broad strokes.
All right. Well, let's continue on now. So I don't expect we're going to get through everything we have, but we want to keep moving for time's sake.
I might let's see. I'll be fast on, well, no, we can talk about this for a bit. This is important. Now we're going to kind of talk about what Nietzsche moved on to next, which was the genealogy of morality, the origins of morality. Obviously, the typical Western man, especially after Plato and after Christ, believes morality is something built into the fabric of the universe, built into God's word, God's breath, into the Bible, etc. Whereas Nietzsche does not believe that. He believes that there's a genealogy of morals. There's an origin of morals, that it comes from the human mind and human culture. And that today, maybe that's kind of a, not very surprising idea. I think a lot of people have heard such critiques of moral ideas, especially from Marxists, for example. Marxists like to critique Christianity as kind of a justification for the rule of the bourgeoisie or whatever. Whereas back in, the 1870s and 1880s, when these ideas were coming out, this was mind-blowing. This was extremely radical, and this really was questioning the fundamental foundations of Western civilization. Just to give you some context of what we're looking at. So we can do the, let's see, this would be, I think, number 5 for your quotes.
Roger, switching to 5.
It says like boyhood and youth, 44 on top.
Yep.
Okay, great. So this will be kind of a long quote, and it should more or less relate to what I just said. So here we go. To make this rather complicated reasoning more clear, it is necessary to follow Nietzsche through his devious twists and windings of his exhaustive inquiry into the origin of moral codes. In making this inquiry, he tried to rid himself of all considerations of authority and reverence. Just as the surgeon, in performing a difficult and painful operation, tries to rid himself of all sympathy and emotion. Adopting this plan, he found that a code of morals was nothing more than a system of customs, laws, and ideas, which had its origin in the instinctive desire of some definite race to live under conditions which best subserved its own welfare. The morality of the Egyptians, he found, was one thing. The morality of the Goths was another. The reason for the difference lay in the fact that the environment of the Egyptians, the climate of their land, the nature of their food supply, and the characteristics of the people surrounding them differed from the environment of the Goths. The morality of each race was, in brief, its consensus of instinct, and once having formulated and found it good, each sought to give it force and permanence. This was accomplished by putting it into the mouths of the gods. What was once a mere expression of instinct thus became a mandate of the divine lawgiver. What was once a mere attempt to meet imminent and usually temporary conditions of existence thus became a code of rules to be obeyed forever, no matter how much these conditions of existence might change. Wherefore, Nietzsche concluded that the chief characteristic of a moral system was its tendency to perpetuate itself unchanged and destroy all who questioned or denied it. So there's a lot more I could quote, but we'll just stop it there because this is a lot to quote. So that's really what Nietzsche discovered by attempting to break morality down and find its origins. He fundamentally denied any form of metaphysics. He was a complete atheist, and a lot of people today believe that there was a lot of personal stuff there, especially due to his family being a family of priests and him being raised by a very religious mother. That probably had a lot of effect on how he viewed religion. But he throws away the idea that God makes religion. He's like, okay, well then God makes morality, excuse me. Okay, well then where does morality really come from? Well, he's like, okay, looking around, it really looks like it comes from what's best for the environment. It comes from, hey, the Egyptians, they're a pretty powerful civilization. They're pretty isolated though. And they need to work together to not starve to death because they have very little farmland. And if they don't have a strong state, they'll collapse. What's their morality? Oh, if we look at Egyptian morality, it's worshiping the pharaoh as a god. It's listening to him no matter what and giving him, 20% of your grain every year. Oh, that's fascinating, And he especially does this for the Jews. And basically what he discovered for people like the Jews is that Jewish morality is based off of submission and extreme loyalty to the in-group. That's the fundamental moral characteristics of Judaism. And he explains that as, the Jews were a very small tribe that had to defend itself from a lot of different people, which is true. You read the Bible, that's obviously true. And in order to survive, it developed a morality of, submissiveness, kindness, love thy neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. And it did that in order to make slavery to other groups like the Neo-Syrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, etc., more tolerable. They're really good slaves, really kind slaves, really nice slaves. So, therefore, they get treated better and they get rewards. And if they do this for thousands of years, you get the modern Jew. And then you get modern Judaism, and you maybe even get modern Christianity. But we'll get onto that later. And that's kind of the basics of this so far. Is there any questions?
I think we should keep going.
Yeah, right. Let's see. Yeah, we can do this. So this would be this would be, I think, slide number 6. Are you guys ready?
Yeah, I'm just clicking the button.
Okay.
If you start reading,
it just takes a second.
Okay, I'll just start reading when I get there. So this is kind of contextualizing Nietzsche's genealogy of morality. So Nietzsche found that all existing moral ideas might be divided into 2 broad classes, corresponding to to 2 broad varieties of human beings, the masters and the slaves. Every man is either a master or a slave. And the same is true of every race. Either it rules some other race or it is itself ruled by some other race. It is impossible to think of a man or a people as being utterly isolated. Even if this was last possible, it is obvious that the community would be divided into those who ruled and those who obeyed. The masters are strong and are capable of doing as they please. The slaves are weak and must obtain whatever rights they crave by deceiving, cajoling, or collectively intimidating their masters. Now, since all moral codes, as we have seen, are merely collections of rules laid down by some definite group of human beings for their comfort and protection, it is evident that the morality of the master class has for its main object the preservation of the authority and kingship of that class, while the morality of the slave class seeks to make slavery as bearable as possible and to exalt and dignify those in which the slave can hope to become the apparent equal or superior of his master. The civilization which existed in Europe before the dawn of Christianity was a culture based upon master morality. And so we find that the theologians and moralists of those days esteemed a certain action as right only when it plainly subserved the best interests of the strong, resourceful men. The ideal man that came at the time was not a meek and lowly sufferer bearing his cross uncomplainingly, but an alert, proud, and combative being who knew his right and dared maintain them. In consequence, we find that in many ancient languages, the words good and aristocratic were synonymous. Whatever served to make man a nobleman, cunning, wealth, physical strength, eagerness to resent and punish injuries, was considered virtuous, praiseworthy, and moral. On the other hand, whatever tend to make a man sink to the level of the great masses, humility, lack of ambition, modest desires, lavish liberality, and a spirit of ready forgiveness was regarded as immoral and wrong. So that's a pretty controversial take for the 1870s, I'd say. Any questions in respect to that?
Right. So this is basically the root of the foundation for his critique of Christianity. However, couldn't one take this sort of environmental determinist philosophy and flip it against him? That it's perhaps one or the other is better suited, regardless of how we view being a master or a slave.
In respect to it's kind of like arbitrary.
Not necessarily arbitrary, but just if one of these just so happens to arise and do well, I don't mean to like put Darwinian language on this, but if we just observe that a master morality or a slave morality takes root at a certain place and subsists for however long, we can conclude that it was best suited for that environment. Can't that just sort of be flipped around?
So I would say yes, and Nietzsche would actually agree with you. And this is kind of a confusing thing about Nietzsche, and Mencken's going to bring this up later, is Nietzsche didn't view it as possible to like undo these trends. He just used these words, slave, master, etc., as descriptions. Obviously, like he believed he was a master, as everyone does who writes philosophy like this. I think they all believe they're masters. But he would definitely agree with you. He would say, yeah, I mean, there's going to be environments where the slaves rise and the masters fall. There's going to be environments where the masters rise and the slaves are enslaved. And fundamentally, he didn't see anything wrong with that. What he saw as wrong is people who could be masters succumbing themselves to slavery, Christian slave morality, as he would call it. That's what he was arguing against. Now, obviously, he's a determinist. He doesn't believe in free will. And so, as we'll see later. And so it's kind of confusing why he makes these arguments, but that's just kind of a paradox of determinism that's common in all deterministic philosophies.
There's something a little bit deeper going on here, because what he's describing in terms of master and slave morality is actually he's not classifying philosophical systems permanently into one or the other, but basically how people position themselves in terms of, well, he's describing a real existing power relationship between classes of people, right? Masters and slaves. The masters are writing the moral philosophy, and at some point in time you can just pay indulgences to get out of purgatory. You can crusade to have your sins forgiven forever, and obviously these things serve direct geopolitical interest for the master class. Meanwhile, the slaves, who just follow it, who pay the indulgence, who go on the crusade, are the actual slaves, right? But that's not to say that Christianity itself is necessarily a slave morality for everyone who practices it. This is sort of a common, I would say, misuse of Nietzsche's philosophy. And we talked about, defending yourself against it in the beginning of the stream. This is a particularly important defense, because if you were, it's quite clear currently the master class is absolutely not Christian, and it's not even remotely trying to use Christian morality to control the masses, right? That's simply not what they're doing at all. I don't think anyone would honestly argue that the master class is using Christianity in order to drive the slaves. Now, if you take a look at the whether or not one is a master or slave is a fact of reality, not a claimed status based on what philosophy you're picking. So you have this sort of like a la carte religion and philosophy thing going on the modern right, where especially on the pagan side of things, maybe it's a bit polemic or hypocritical for me to say that, but whatever. Talking about a pagan might argue that, like, or whatever type of pagan you are, whether we mentioned Mike from Imperium Press earlier, whether or not you're just like purely Nietzschean or whatever, you aren't a master moralist just because you reject Christianity and adopt your own like arbitrary moral frame, so long as you're still you're not in the master role, right? You don't become a master necessarily just by internally believing something. It's describing a real power relationship. What would you say to that? What would Nietzsche say to that?
He would agree with everything you just said. As for starting with the Christian thing, I just want to say, I mean, the reason why I I don't consider Christianity slave morality inherently, and Nietzsche, his more scathing critiques of Christianity he wrote as his mental illness was developing, which I'll get into maybe at the end of this because it's important to know. But um, my view of Christianity is, Christianity is something that can balance the slave and master dialectic within itself. And you can see that, with what you described, the Crusades, with indulgences and, concept of, the serverless knight and, um, just the concept of a Christian hierarchical feudal society contains masters within it and can contain a lot of master morality concept within that noble class. I would just say it's still has what Nietzsche would call more slavish elements allowed within it. Obviously, with Jesus's teachings, which kind of balance the master morality and keep it in check, along with giving the masses a morality to live day by day in very difficult conditions of medieval peasantry. And I think it's easy for people, online, like H.L. or not online. H.L. Mencken was on the internet, obviously. It's easy for people like H.L. Mencken and even modern neo-pagans to kind of look down on these medieval Christians as slave morality people when, these people live very difficult lives and were, much tougher in many respects than you are, and still held on to Christ and used it as a way to understand the world and live a better life. So I think we need to be more nuanced and balanced in an analysis like that. And Nietzsche is. I think it's in The Gay Science, which is, I think, Nietzsche's third or fourth book. He writes that, like, even in a Christian society, Christianity itself can cultivate and bring forth people of a masterful stock. He would say that, Christianity gives much more room for what he would call slavish populations to live more prosperously. That's what he would say to that.
I would also just add to that, given our condition as slaves to masters, slaves who could be masters, who who actively seek to be masters, if something like Christian nationalism succeeds in overthrowing the current moral order and becomes the new moral framework, then it by definition is a master morality and not the other way around, if that happens. So
no, and that's a great point. And like, I mean, I would kind of describe like Christianity today is a master morality in the making. That's what I would say in response to that. And really, like, the woke, horrifying hellscape reality we live in now is a master morality quickly collapsing into a slave morality. And I think it's actually important to consider that because Nietzsche, unlike a lot of people who hold to this like master slave dynamic, Nietzsche believed that if you're a master and you cannot hold to the standard of a master, you should be thrown into slavery immediately. He did not believe in any form of like inherited masterfulness. And like if you're a slave and you're a genius and you're very capable and and noble, in his eyes, you should become a master. So, these ideas can also move between master and slave systems.
Yeah,
and that also lines up perfectly with Nietzsche. But sorry, what were you saying, Ryan?
That makes sense with Mencken's philosophy as well, because whenever we got to his criticism of systems of government a few weeks ago, it might have come to a surprise to some in the audience that someone on the right might criticize an aristocratic form of government, in which Mencken described it as a conspiracy to advantage those who are inferior but superior in law against the actual superior man. So this all should all sound very reminiscent.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's perfect. Moving on, let's see. I'm going to skip quote number 8, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, quote number 8 we'll skip. So let's see. Kind of just moving on. Sorry, I don't want to have dead air, but his next thing he really talks about. He talks about the Superman. I'm going to get into that later because he talks about it twice in this book, and the second time he talks about it is a little bit better. So we'll kind of move past that. Let's see. Okay, we can talk about this. So what have we talked about so far? So we've talked about Dionysius and Apollo and, master-slave morality, the genealogy of morality. Well, that's great and all, but what's really, what is the point of this? What's the point of a master's life? How can a master even determine his own welfare? That's an important question to Nietzsche. And really what that means is, sure, master morality is taking what you want and ruling over other people and believing in things that give you power in the physical world. Sure. But, power to what end? To what form of welfare? And this quote here kind of explores that. So here we go. How is a man to define and determine his own welfare and that of the race after him? Here indeed are Dionysian immoralist, and here you can see that he identifies immoral Dionysian master morality as kind of one large thing, is confronted by a very serious problem, and Nietzsche himself well understood its seriousness. Unless we have in mind some definite ideal of happiness and some definite goal of progress, we had better sing the doxology and dismiss our congregation. Christianity has such an ideal and such a goal. The one is a Christ-like life on earth, and the other is a place at the right hand of Jehovah in the hereafter. Mohammedanism, which is Islam, a tinsel form of Christianity, paints pictures of the same sort. Buddhism holds out the tempting bait of a race set free from the thrall of earthly desires, with an eternity of blissful nothingness. The other Oriental faiths lead in the same direction, and Schopenhauer, in his philosophy, laid down the doctrine that humanity would attain perfect happiness only when it had overcome its instinct to self-preservation. That is to say, when it had ceased its desire to live. So, real fast, I'm just going to give some context. Arthur Schopenhauer is a philosopher, very famous 19th century German philosopher. He is by far Nietzsche's biggest influence. And to kind of give you a very, very basic spark notes, Schopenhauer believed in a dharmic Buddhist Hindu sort of life is suffering, life is not worth living. You need to renounce all desires, and you need to basically enter an ascetic lifestyle and then die. And then, Buddhists and dharmic peoples believe in samsara, and then you can escape reality. I don't really know what Arthur Schopenhauer believed the afterlife was like, but whatever. That's what Schopenhauer believed. And Nietzsche read that. He really believed it for a little bit, and then he rejected it completely. And he flipped it on its head. He's like, no, we need to say yes to life. And we need to accept that life is a struggle, and it's will to power, and it's, trying to achieve the life of the master. And only a slave would believe in something like Schopenhauer would believe life is not worth living. So just to give that context real quick. But Schopenhauer, in his philosophy, laid down the doctrine that humanity would attain perfect happiness only when it had overcome the instinct of self-preservation. That is to say, when he had ceased to desire to live. Even Christian Science, which I think is like, I've seen their churches before. I don't really know what Christian Science is.
It's a very strange denomination that's not as popular anymore.
Okay. That most grotesque child of the credulous faith and incredible denial offers us the double ideal of a mortal life, entirely free from mortal pain, and a harp in the heavenly band for all eternity. What had Nietzsche to author in place of these things? By what standard was his immoralist to separate the good or beneficial thing from the world or bad, from the bad or damaging things? And what was the goal that the philosopher had in mind for his immoralist? The answer to the first question had to be found in Nietzsche's definition of the term good and bad. All that elevates the sense of power, the will to power, and power itself. That is how you define good. All that proceeds from weakness, this is how it defined bad. Happiness, he held, is the feeling that power increases, that resistance is being overcome. I preach not contentedness, he says, but more power, not peace, but war, not virtue, but efficiency. The weak and defective must go to the wall. That is the first principle of the Dionysian charity, and we must help them to go. To put it more simply, Nietzsche offered the gospel of prudent and intelligent selfishness, of absolute and utter individualism. One must learn, sang Zarathustra, how to love oneself with a whole and hearty love. One may find life and oneself endurable, and not know gadding about. This gadding about is familiar. It is called loving one's neighbor. His ideal was an aristocracy which regarded the proletariat merely as a conglomeration of draft animals made to be driven, enslaved, and exploited. A good and healthy aristocracy, he said, must acquiesce with a good conscience in sacrifice of a legion of individuals who, for its benefit, will be reduced to slaves and tools. The masses have no right to exist on their own account. Their sole excuse for living lies in their usefulness as a sort of superstructure or scaffolding, upon which a more select race of beings may be elevated. Yada, yada, yada. That's kind of, he keeps going in respect to that.
So this I find fascinating with the state of the current right, because it's currently very popular to talk about power, but in a collective sense. Individualism is a bad word, and whatnot else, and it's only through the collective that one can get power, and really the collective is like the primary moral end, not the individual, which seems to be a fascinating departure from Nietzsche here, despite the fact that many like normie cons and whatever hear this and hear Nietzsche because they say the word power.
Yes. No, that's a very good point. You know, I really question if Nietzsche would participate in. I mean, he didn't participate in politics in 19th century Germany at all. He hated politics. He hated populism. He hated democracy. He hated the entire concept of it. So, you know, and this is kind of a thing we see in the BAP sphere. This is a thing we see in certain neo-pagan spheres: is forget politics, forget this mass politics game of populist democracy. You need to focus on being an aristocratic, master morality kind of guy who reads Nietzsche and does bodybuilding and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think they take it too far in the opposite direction towards a kind of toxic, self-destructive individualism. But I think here it's really important that we see, this kind of aristocratic elite element within the right as more like this. And the masses, we don't have to call them slave cattle because that's like kind of cringe, right? And, it's a bit much. But we can see them as, more normal people that we're going to have to not necessarily pander to all the time, that we're going to have to be above. And I mean, I think a lot of people on the right have pushed these kind of ideas with, like the talented 10th or no, not the talented 10th.
Close.
Sorry,
like
the gang of
Vanguard
10s.
or something like that.
Yeah, the Vanguard,
right.
the gang of 10s, the talented. Sorry.
It's the same concept, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think it's very important to always remember this kind of individualistic master morality kind of thing, and balance it with a more populist mass politics. Anything else?
I want to focus more on this individualist aspect here. Obviously, I have my own political background that would lead me to want to focus on this, but I find it fascinating. There's sort of like a meme right-wing ideology that sees that like the conservatives, libertarians, fusionists, and what have you of the last few decades preached individualism, and our countries fell apart. And now, therefore, if we want to win our countries back, be politically effective, understand reality, and what have you, you must reject individualism. But here you have perhaps one of the most influential philosophers on the right wing in general, not saying that, but instead talking about individualism as a category that is somewhat essential to elevating oneself. So what is the you mentioned that there are certain parts of the right that have a self-destructive idea of individualism, but then what's the proper way to view it?
I mean that's a very good question. If I had to say, really, I mean, kind of what we're doing here in the OGC is a good start. Really, a form of like, we are an independent political vanguard with very strong principles that we're not going to shake from. And if we have to hold to those principles and hold to certain standards that maybe, collectively inconvenient sometimes, so be it. That's going to make us stronger and more principled as political actors within the greater sphere, but even in local politics. That's maybe an angle we can go for. What would you say, Ryan? Because you are very your background would definitely have some really good points on this.
I don't know as much. I actually didn't prepare for this. It was just something I noticed going over the notes that you took. However, it might bleed through. The audience might be able to see the fact that we've gone over Mencken for some month or so. I still find it to be a useful category of thinking. By the fact that I called it a meme view to discard it altogether, I think that's wrong. But I don't know that I'm prepared to give a full view. But with that out of the way, then if we don't have anything more, we should probably keep going.
Yeah, I'll just comment really quick before we move on, which we should. But the take on Nietzsche that you mentioned, sort of in the BAP sphere, is kind of interesting because, again, Nietzsche's concept of good, that which increases your sense of power, your will to power, and power itself, is again in relation to other humans. In the BAP sphere, generally, it seems to be a highly internalized phenomenon where you improve the self, you weight lift, you read philosophy, you whatever, but you're not really increasing your power. Maybe you're increasing your sense of power, maybe you're increasing your physical power, just in a very small sense in relation to the people around you. But it is pretty interesting because I don't really think Nietzsche himself would really view what the BAP sphere generally kind of gets into, or at least states they get into. I mean, I don't know how many of them actually like do serious weightlifting training or not, but it doesn't really seem to be an actual direct implementation of Nietzsche's concept of what master morality, what good is. Basically, if you're doing good by Nietzsche's definition, then you're basically like increasing your actual power, and not just sort of this entirely internalized concept, like where the BAP like leaders in any sphere, political or otherwise, right? Like there are none as far as I can identify.
I completely agree. And that's why I'm not in the BAP sphere. Nietzsche would have thought bodybuilding was laughable. For the most part. I mean, I think he would have respected athletes, but like bodybuilding for its own sake, I think he would have found to be ridiculous. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on. I agree with you. We can skip that. It's just more of the same. So now we're going to kind of move on to the Superman. So the Superman as a concept is very misunderstood. I would say even for Mencken, this is something he gets slightly wrong. And I would say, I don't hold it against him at all, because he wrote this in 1907 or whatever, when there was literally no English language Nietzsche literature available at the time. But, the Superman fundamentally is an ideal form of humanity that we should strive for, according to Nietzsche. So what does that mean? That sounds pretty broad, right? And how does that relate to like will to power, like what we just talked about? Well, the will to power is basically follow your instincts, do what you want, take what you want. The more you take, the better you'll feel. Most human beings cannot do that. Most human beings for one reason or another, find that unpleasant, difficult, or unconscionable. Whereas Nietzsche says, okay, that's bad. What we need to do is we need to aim humanity towards that ideal, towards a person who follows their own instincts and pursues power. And power, on its most fundamental level, is just the modification of the physical world to his own ends, the modification of sense experience to his own ends. That is a fundamental good, and you shouldn't ask why. You shouldn't question if this is right or wrong. You should just do it, right? And the person that can do that perfectly, that is the Superman. And this is an ideal that Nietzsche replaced. He basically replaced Jesus Christ with the Superman, with the Übermensch. And he identified it as something that human beings would strive for into the far future if they adopted his system. And importantly, what the Superman is not is he is not, the Germanic Übermensch super soldier of the Third Reich. He is not something that's going to appear one day. I don't really think Nietzsche ever believed that the Superman was something that was going to appear and something that was going to come into existence. It was an ideal. I mean, just as Christ himself, obviously, no one lives just like Christ. I think everyone here would agree with that. It's something that we all strive to be. Well, he wanted everyone to strive to be the Übermensch. So that's kind of a fundamentally misunderstood thing by a lot of people. And that's what this quote here touches on. So I'll just read it real quick. What was the goal Nietzsche had laid out in mind for his immoralist? What was to be the final outcome of his overturning of all morality? Did he believe the human race would progress until men became gods and controlled the sun and stars as they now control the flow of great rivers? Or did he believe that the end of it would all be the annihilation? After the publication of Nietzsche's earlier books, with their ruthless tearing down of the old morality, these questions were asked by critics innumerable by all countries of Europe. The philosopher was laughed at as a crazy iconoclast who destroyed without rebuilding. He was called a visionary and a lunatic, and it was reported and believed that he had no answer, that his philosophy was doomed to bear itself to the earth, like an arch without a keystone. But in April 1883, he began the publication of Also sprach Zarathustra, Thus spoke Zarathustra, and therein his reply was written large. I teach you, cries Zarathustra, the Superman. Man is something that shall be surpassed. What? To man is the ape, a joke or a shame. Man shall be the same to the Superman. A joke or a shame. Man is a bridge connecting ape to the Superman. The Superman will be the final flower and the ultimate expression of the earth. I conjure you to be faithful to the earth, to cease looking beyond the stars for your hopes and rewards. You must sacrifice yourself to the earth, that one day it may bring forth the Superman. So, a lot of people say, or this was really a common critique in the early 20th century, is Nietzsche didn't replace Christianity with anything. Well, that's not true. He did. He replaced it with the Superman. And you can criticize that. You can say it's not adequate, but it is a replacement for Christianity. So yeah, that's kind of everything I have there. Any questions?
Do you have another section going further into this before we do ask questions?
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
So here's a couple more quotes. In the Superman, Nietzsche showed the world a conceivable and possible goal for all human effort. But there still remained a problem, and it was this. When the Superman at last appears on Earth, what then? Will there be another Superman to follow a Superman after that? In the end, will man become the equal of the creator of the universe, whatever he may be? Or will a period of decline come after, with return down the long line through the Superman to man again, and then onto the anthropoid ape, to the lower animals, to the asexual cell, and finally to the mere inert matter, gas, and ether, and empty space? Nietzsche answered these questions by offering a theory that the universe moves in regular cycles and that all which is now happening on Earth, all in the stars, to the utmost, will be repeated again and again throughout eternity. In other words, he dreamed of a cosmic year corresponding in some fashion to the terrestrial year. Man, who has sprung from the elements, will rise into Superman, and perhaps infinitely beyond, and then, in the end, by catastrophe or slow decline, he will be resolved in primary elements again, and the whole process will begin anew. So, real quick, that is alluding to the topic I want to talk about after this, which is the eternal recurrence. So first we'll talk about the Superman.
This is a concept very reminiscent of cyclical theorists talking about man reverting back to apes, thus explaining the population of apes in, say, Africa and what have you. So this is interesting that you can actually find a lot of these cyclical theories in Nietzsche, who predated a lot of these cyclical theorists of history. Not all of them, but many of them.
So I will just say Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is similar to this. I will say I don't think Nietzsche thought the Superman would ever exist. He saw it as an ideal instead of something that would come and then disappear over and over again. But I just wanted to bring that up again. Any other comments?
I think we should probably move on.
Okay. So yeah, so replace Jesus with the Superman, and the Superman is simply a person who can fully inhabit will to power without doubt, without, what Nietzsche would consider slavish moral questions. So now we're going to move on to the next topic, which is the eternal recurrence. So the eternal recurrence is very simple. It's literally just a hypothetical. Nietzsche, for a time, thought it might be real, and it really, really freaked him out. And he spent some time studying physics in the 1800s to see if it was possible that it was real. And then he decided it wasn't, and it made him relax a lot. And then it just turned into a hypothetical. But the hypothetical goes like this. Wake up every day and assume that the day you're about to live will happen forever. It'll repeat eternally. The day before will repeat eternally, and the day after will repeat eternally. And if you live by this hypothetical, you will live the best life you can possibly live, in a life that fulfills your will to power and your affirmation of living in this world. That is the eternal recurrence as a hypothetical. And that's why here, what I just said, he mentions humans going to apes, going to gas, going to cells, whatever. It's a repeating cycle. And, if Nietzsche truly believed this, or if he just thought it was a really important hypothetical, who knows? But, there are a lot of modern Nietzscheans who definitely believe this. Neo-pagans love this kind of stuff. If you've ever read neo-pagan texts, they all say that, paganism is an inherently cyclical religion, which is true. Like Norse paganism, for example, has an eternal cycle where that wolf will eat the moon and everything will reset, and then we respawn on the beach in Asgard or whatever, whatever happens in neo-paganism. They believe stuff like that. And this is a very common principle of neo-pagan circles today. Obviously, Christians don't believe this. We believe in, the eschaton and whatever's going to happen in heaven after that. But we don't believe that necessarily that everything is going to repeat exactly perfectly forever, like neo-pagans do. So I have another quote here that kind of expands on the eternal recurrence in the Superman. So, I will come back, muses Zarathustra, with the sun, with this earth, with this eagle, with this serpent, not for a new life or a better life, but to the same life I am now leading. I will come back under the same old life in the greatest things and in the smallest, in order to teach once more the eternal recurrence of all things. In the end, Nietzsche turned this fantastic idea into a device for exalting his Superman. The Superman is one who realizes that all of his struggles will be in vain, and that in future cycles he will have to go through them over and over again. Yet he has attained pain, that the prospect does not daunt him. Despite its horror, he faces it unafraid. It is all a part of life, and in consequence, it is good. He has learned to agree that everything that exists, even the ghastly necessity for living again and again. In a word, he does not fear an endless series of lives, because life to him has lost all of its terrors, which merely a human man sees in it. So, there you go. The Superman as a concept should also embrace the eternal recurrence. He should embrace that, he wakes up one day, he's going to say, wow, the day I'm living right now is going to repeat forever. And I must live it to the fullest so that I don't regret, in the future, with these infinite amount of times I experience it, I'm not regretting what I've done. So that's kind of the eternal recurrence of the Superman merged together.
I think we should also read the next excerpt that you have, just to
yes,
enrich this idea a little bit further.
So from this, it must be plain that the Superman will have the same guides that we have vis-a-vis his instincts and senses, but in him they will be more accurate and more acute than us, because the whole tendency of his scheme of things will be to fortify and develop them. If any race of Europe devoted a century to exercising its right arms, its descendants in the century following would have right arms like piston rods. In the same way, the Superman, by subordinating everything else to his instinct to live, will make it evolve into something very accurate and efficient. His whole concern in brief will be to live as long as possible and avoid so much as possible other things which shorten life, by injuring the body from without or by using the energy within. As a result, he will cease all effort to learn why the world exists and will devote himself to acquiring knowledge on how it exists. This knowledge, how, will be within his capacity even more than within his capacity today. Our senses, as we have seen, have given us absolute knowledge that stubbing toe results in swelling and pain. The Superman developed senses will give him absolute knowledge of everything that exists on Earth. He will really know how the tubercle bacillus attacks the lung tissue. He will know exactly how the blood fights the bacillus, and he will know exactly how to interfere in the battle in such a manner that the blood will be invariably victorious. In a word, he will be the professor of exact and complete knowledge regarding the working of all benign and malignant forces in the world about him. But he will not bother himself with insoluble problems. He will waste no time speculating as to why tubercle bacilli was sent into the world. His instinct to live will be satisfied by his success in stamping them out. So, oh yeah, and then I'm going to throw in this quote because it relates to America, and I think it kind of identifies a Dionysian nature of America that's important. In the profane folk philosophy of every healthy and vigorous people, we find some trace of this Dionysian idea. Let us so live day by day, says a distinguished American statesman, so that we can look any man in the eye and tell him to go to hell. We get a subtle sort of joy out of this saying because it voices our racial advance towards individualism and away from servility and oppression. We believe in freedom, in toleration, in moral anarchy. We have put this notion into innumerable homely forms. Quote, things have come to hell of a pass when a man can't wallop his own jackass. So we phrase it, the Superman did stalk the earth would say the same thing.
So this is something I find fascinating, just going throughout all the episodes that we've done on American Spirits, and it's also why I thought we might find some things of interest in this book on Friedrich Nietzsche. Is that a lot of the I don't want to say mindset because that sort of psychologizes it, but like the outlook of the Superman, the Nietzschean ideal. You can really actually find a lot of that in American cultures, folkways, history. Obviously, the thing that probably comes to mind for Charlie and I and anyone in the audience is that the backcountry settlers, going back to the first few episodes of the series, exercised a sort of morality very similar to this, one of moral anarchy, if you will, just bounded by force. But you can also see it in especially the struggle for independence against Britain. Whenever we covered someone like Thomas Paine, where it was something very similar. We were trying to escape what was tantamount in our minds to moral slavery, so that we could exist in our own way. So this is you're very correct. I think that this is very much bound in sort of American thought, morality, and what have you. It very much explains, maybe in hindsight, why it is the way why it is that we act this way, or how.
Yes, and I would expand this a bit, where it's like, America's known, especially today, for its unstoppable technological progress, and that is highlighted here very well, because all the Superman asks is how, and for an example today, how do we create artificial general intelligence? Now, a lot of people in the OGC, including me to an extent, have doubts that artificial general intelligence is possible or that it will ever be profitable, etc. But no one cares, no one asks that, and no one asks, what are the moral or philosophical consequences of AGI? What we have is we have Silicon Valley, and we have, trillions of dollars in money in cash and thousands of highly intelligent people working around the clock to try to answer that question. Can we do it? How can we do it? From it, how is this going to affect our society, etc. But we're not asking why, and we're not asking if it's a good idea. And we're not, waxing poetic about how this is going to affect the working class or unemployment or family formation or anything. We're just doing it. And that's really a fundamental aspect of American culture. And, obviously a lot of people would critique that. A lot of people in certain right-wing circles who read certain Italian wizard philosophers would critique that and say that's bad and, say that America deserves to be destroyed for such perspectives. But, from my perspective, it's what America is. And I think it's given us a lot of great things. And I think it's, having a Dionysian element within our civilization is why we've succeeded in so many ways. And maybe today it's gone too far. Maybe today it's done a lot of damage, but in the end, it's part of who we are, and it's something we're going to have to deal with into the future. But yeah.
I think that's good. I think we should keep going.
What time do you think we have? Like another hour?
Usually we go about 2 hours. So that's 35 minutes, but we can go longer. It's fine.
Okay, we're
close to halfway through the screenshots, so it's fine if we go over 2 hours.
Let me just really quickly. Okay. Well, we're at the Christian part now, so we can do that, and then we'll do some fun quotes, and then we'll probably just wrap it up. So I think we've really broken down Nietzsche 101 here already. Everything we just talked about is kind of what Nietzsche discovered as just somewhat, I don't want to call it like value neutral, but it kind of is just value neutral analysis of the world. This is what he thought was true, and this is what he wrote out. This is how the world works, in his opinion. And the fundamentals you just listened to, audience, is good foundation for talking to neo-pagans, maybe even arguing with a neo-pagan, or, deepening your understanding of the dialectic between Christians and pagans today. Now we're going to move on to something that's even more important, and that's kind of an in-depth analysis of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. So we're going to start here. Christianity, says Nietzsche, is the most dangerous system of slave morality the world has ever known. It has waged a deadly war against the highest type of man. It has put a ban on all his functional instincts. It has distilled evil out of these instincts. It makes the strong and efficient man its typical outcast man. It has taken the part of the weak and the low. It has made an ideal out of its antagonism to the very instincts which tend to preserve life and well-being. It has taught men to regard their highest impulses as sinful, as temptations. In a word, it tends to rob mankind of all those qualities which fit any living organism to survive in the struggle for existence. So that's one. We can move on to the next one real quick. Nietzsche maintains that Christianity urges a man to make no such efforts to ensure his personal survival in the struggle for existence. The Beatitudes require, he says that instead of trying to do so, the Christian shall devote his energies to helping others and shall give no thought to himself. And then I think, yes. And then then we have two more quotes. I'm just going to read them all because they're really good. Sympathy, says Nietzsche, consists merely of a strong man giving up some of his strength to a weak man. The strong man, it is evident, is debilitated thereby, while the weak man very often is strengthened but little. If you go to hanging and sympathize with the condemned, it is plain that your mental distress without helping the gentleman weakens to a perceptible degree your own mind and body, just as all other powerful emotions weaken them, by consuming energy, and so you are handicapped in the struggle for life to the extent of this weakness. You may get a practical proof of it an hour later by being overcome and killed by a footpad, which is like a bandit, whom you might have been able to conquer, but you have been feeling had you been feeling perfectly well, or by losing money to some financial rival for whom, under normal conditions, you would have been a match. But then again, you may get no immediate or tangible proof of it at all, but your organism will have been weakened to some measurable extent. All the same, and to some time, perhaps on your deathbed, this minute drain will make itself evident, though of course you may never know it. Sympathy, says Nietzsche, stands in direct antithesis to the tonic passions which elevate the energy of human beings and increase their feelings of efficiency and power. It is a depressant. One loses force by synthesizing and by any loss of force which has been caused by other means. Personal suffering, for example, is increased and multiplied by sympathy. Suffering itself becomes contagious through sympathy, and under certain circumstances, it may lead to a total loss of life. If proof of that is desired, consider the case of the Nazarene, whose sympathy for his fellow men brought him in the end to the cross. Final quote here, I think. Let me see. Yes. It may be asked here how Nietzsche accounted for the fact that humanity had survived so long, for the fact that the majority of men were still physically healthy and that the race as a whole was still fairly vigorous in respect to Christianity existing in Europe. He answered to this in two ways. First, he denied that the race was maintaining its old vigor. The European of the present, he said, is far below the European of the Renaissance. It would be absurd, he pointed out, to allege that the average German in 1880 was as strong and as healthy, i.e., as well fitted to his environment, as the quote-unquote blonde beast who roamed the Saxon lowlands in the days of the mammoth. It would be equally absurd to maintain that the highest product of modern civilization, the town dweller, was as vigorous and as capable of becoming the father of healthy children as the intelligent farmer, whose life was spent in approximate accordance with the more obvious laws of health. Nietzsche's second answer was that humanity had escaped utter degeneration and destruction because, despite the dominance of a theory of action, few men actually practiced Christianity. It was next to impossible, he said, to find a single man who, literally and absolutely, obeyed the teachings of Christ. There were plenty of men who thought they were doing so, but all of them were yielding in only a partial manner. Absolute Christianity meant the absolute disregard of self. It was obvious that a man who reached this state of mind would be unable to follow any gainful occupation, and so would find it impossible to preserve his own life or the lives of his children. In brief, said Nietzsche, an actual and utter Christian would perish just as Christ perished, and so, in his own fate, would provide a conclusive argument against Christianity. Okay, so that's kind of a view on Nietzsche's perspective on Christianity. That's 101 for what he thinks. Any comments?
Yeah, so the second to last quote that we had about sympathy I find very interesting because the policies, regardless of the other motives that I'm sure many of us would like to talk about, but just the bare policies that many of the leaders of Western nations have enacted in the last century and a half, give or take, have been in the name of sympathy. Almost all of these policies have destroyed, say, the wealth and savings of these nations, weakened the borders, or what have you, destroyed their empires and whatnot, all in the name of sympathy. So I find this absolutely fascinating, because then if you look at the modern right today, there's like a big tendency to find the people suffering the most in the modern day, this very natural sympathy towards these people who are being completely destroyed by the modern systems in place, and then build an entire political system basically out of this sympathy, or perhaps out of revenge on behalf of those people. It seems fundamentally the opposite of what Nietzsche would say to do, which is not to act out of sympathy, but just to destroy the thing that's decreasing your vitality, that's harming you.
Yes.
And I suppose if you need something like concrete to prove that, there's a huge contingent of the right going from fairly normie-ish types all the way to post-liberals, talking about the plight of the working class, sympathizing with it heavily, writing these, emotional tear-jerking accounts about the destruction of the working class in Europe and America and whatnot. So it's definitely it's a strain of thought that exists.
Yes, and if you talk to a neo-pagan on the right, they will blame mass immigration on Christian slave morality, and I never found that to be a compelling argument, because Europe was Christian for 1500 years and brutally fought wars of racial annihilation against groups all the time, and resisted foreign invasion from Muslims for 1300 years. So, clearly Christianity itself cannot be the cause of this, because, why would it accelerate, and why would this happen the moment Christianity leaves Europe? Because obviously modern Europe is basically an atheistic society, so it doesn't really make any sense, in my opinion. But no, I mean, And in respect to kind of the modern right's perspective on sympathy for the working class and sympathy for, maybe you want to call it like the chud, or the young man who is down and out and has no prospects or thinks he has no prospects. Nietzsche would definitely say, like, that's ridiculous. You are falling for slave morality. You need to crawl yourself out of the gutter, and you need to work on yourself. And obviously, Christianity of 200 years ago would have said the same thing. If you were in a Christian village in rural Europe in 1826 and you were a loser, the Christian town community probably would have grabbed you and said, like, you need to get your stuff together, or there's going to be serious consequences. Sure, they'd pray for you and they'd have sympathy for you, but in the end of the day, they would force you to get a job and get married and get your life in order, more or less. So I think there's some critiques of this perspective from Nietzsche, and I think there's definitely a danger on the modern right of like over sympathizing with the chud. Now, a lot of people today like go online and they say chuds are the worst thing ever and they like deserve to die. Like I've seen posts like the modern world is some form of like Darwinian eugenics, and like all the chuds that currently exist like deserve to be exterminated, I guess. I think that's pretty bad. And I think the balancing point here is obviously what some people online have been doing. Like I think Dave Green, who's part of the OGC, has posted some Substack articles about improving young men's lives and trying to make them better and trying to get them prepared for living a good Christian masculine life. And that's kind of the balance we need. And Nietzsche is warning us against going too far in the sympathetic direction. So any other comments here, guys?
I fully agree with that.
Yeah. Anything, Charles?
No. Same as Ryan.
Okay, great. Let's see. So is there anything else I want to say about this? I think we kind of talked about this earlier. Christianity has a lot of nuance. And I think we, as, most of us are Christians in the OGC, I'd say. Most of us, we need to defend the faith that we believe in, but we also need to, we need to have a good understanding of what Nietzsche's saying here, and we need to have good responses. And I think we've already kind of done that. So I'm just going to move on a little bit. Let's see. We can skip this quote. Let's see. Just looking through my quotes real quick. We can skip this quote. Basically, it's just saying that happiness and the discovery of science, and discoveries found within science and the happiness of the Übermensch, the higher man, correlate very strongly. Take that as you will. Let's see. I will read this quote just to kind of give you an idea of how Nietzsche saw truth and how that relates to the masses. So this is kind of just, we've kind of explored Nietzsche 101. So now we're just going to kind of do some final bits and snippets here, and then maybe we'll wrap things up. So this is Nietzsche, Truth, and the Masses. The fact that the great majority of human beings are utterly incapable of original thought, and so must, perforce, borrow their ideas or submit tamely to some authority, explains Nietzsche's violent loathing and contempt for the masses. The average self-satisfied, conservative, orthodox, law-abiding citizen appeared to him to be being but a little raised above the cattle in the barnyard. So violent was this feeling that every idea accepted by the majority excited, for that very reason, his suspicion, his opposition. Whatever he believed, he once said, is never true. This may seem like a mere voicing of Brahmdingian egotism. I'm not sure about that word. But as a matter of fact, the same view is held by every man who has spent any time investigating the history of ideas. Truth, said Dr. Osler a while ago, scarcely ever carries the struggle for acceptance as its first experience. The masses are always a century or two behind. They have made a virtue of their obtuseness and call it by various fine names: conservatism, piety, respectability, faith. The 19th century witnessed greater human progress than all the centuries before it saw or even imagined. But the majority of white men today still believe in ghosts, still fear the devil, and still hold the number 13 as unlucky, and still picture the deity of the Christian faith as a patriarch in a white beard, surrounded by a choir of resplendent amateur musicians. Oh, what a great writer. We think a thing, says Professor Henry Sedgwick, because all other people think so, or because, after all, we do think so, or because we're told so, and think we must think so, or because we once thought so, and think we still think so, or because, having thought so, we think we will think so. Indeed. So, you can kind of see how Nietzsche saw mass ideas and saw the truth in respect to the masses. He fundamentally believed that the reality, things that you see from being an intelligent person who can take in sense experience and process it, he thought those things were indigestible to the public. And I cannot necessarily disagree with that. Everyone in this organization, we have to deal with what we call normies, and we can see that normies are quite a bit behind. 200 or 300 years behind, maybe not, but 20 or 30 years behind, sure. And what do you guys think? I think that's true.
Well, I've been criticizing a phenomenon called conservatism very explicitly for about a year and a half now, and I think most people take that to mean like political conservatism or just people who would label themselves as conservatives. And I'm thinking that I actually have a much broader view similar to what Mencken and Nietzsche are talking about here, though not entirely, because clearly I'm not setting out to attack something like Christianity or superstition or what have you, even though especially the last one might be incidentally harmed in the pursuit of this. But I think that a lot of people could be served better by understanding something like conservatism as a dispositional thing, or a set of beliefs that one just naturally happens into based on who that person is, instead of just like a political ideology that starts and ends in politics. So there's been a lot of people trying to, maybe out of like political concern or what have you, trying to present themselves as more normie coded or more conservative coded or what have you. But especially when I was reading this section of the book and the other parts where Mencken and Nietzsche talk about this conservatism, moral puritanism, progressivism, or what have you, it does feel somewhat vindicating that this is not a good trend to trend back to the mass. You're supposed to separate yourself if you actually are above them. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
No, I agree with that completely. And it's something I've definitely been experiencing. So anything else? No? Okay. Let's see. So this is kind of just a funny jab. We can jab at Nietzsche. And I agree with Mencken in this respect. I'll just say, I'm a person who studied Nietzsche for 4 years. I'm actually interested now in restarting my Nietzsche studies from reading this book. But, I'm a person who studied him very seriously, and I've seen a lot of very serious arguments for why you should be Nietzschean. And at the end of my studies, when I decided to take a break from them, I watched a YouTube video, and it was from a very, very important Nietzschean scholar. I'll just name drop him. He's called Essential Salts. You guys should go watch him. But anyways, he said, he really brought up the point, like, Nietzsche would not want you to be obsessed with himself for his entire life, for your entire life. That's not the point. He is not supposed to be your sage. He is just telling you facts, and you should take them in and live your life with them in mind. Whereas, it's kind of funny because Nietzsche himself didn't really take that advice. And Mencken points that out. So herein, unluckily, Nietzsche fell into the trap which is snapped upon Haeckel and every other supporter of atheistic determinism. He denied that the human will was free and argued that every human action was inevitable. And yet he spent his whole life trying to convince his fellow men that they should do otherwise than than as they did in fact. In a word, he held that they had no control whatsoever over their actions, and yet, like Moses, Muhammad, and Saint Francis, he thundered at them uproariously and urged them to turn from their errors and repent. So that's a good argument. You can say, well, Nietzsche was atheistically determined to do that, right? But then it's kind of like a weird paradox, because it's like, why would you be atheistically determined to explain atheistic determinism? And it's a fun thing to think about, but it's just something that Mencken noticed, and I think other people should keep in mind, that Nietzsche's fundamental worldview is not airtight. It's kind of strange, and obviously, everyone who's listening to this has a conscience or an internal monologue. At least I assume everyone here does. I know some populations in the world maybe don't have internal monologues, but I think everyone here does. And it's weird that you have internal monologues and you seem to be making decisions with your internal monologues, but then you're supposed to believe that that's all fake. It's all an illusion, and we're actually deterministic, materialist robots, right? And that's kind of weird, and it's not airtight. So I think it's worth bringing up.
I do think that I find it interesting in your anecdote that Nietzsche would not want you to look to him as a sage, because we covered this at the end of Mencken's Christomathy last week. That's also not how Mencken wanted you to remember him either. If you did read his writings or whatnot, specifically, he wanted to tear down idols. So the thing that the epitaph that he had at the end of his personal collections of his best writings was that if you should think of him and want to please him, just forgive someone. It's an active thing that you could do. It's not like a mindset, a thought, a belief, or what have you. It's just a very basic action. It seems to be another close parallel to how Nietzsche presents himself. They both say things that are true. You need to take the truth if you are a serious person. And beyond that, if you wanted to please them, you should just act as you're supposed to, normally.
Very good. This quote is kind of worth bringing up, considering how warfare is a common thing in the Trumpian age, for better or worse, whatever you happen to believe. So I think this quote is interesting. Nietzsche opposed squarely the demand for peace and the demand for equality, and his opposition was grounded upon two arguments. In the first place, he said both demands were rhetorical and insincere, and all intelligent men knew they would neither be fully satisfied. In the second place, he said it would be ruinous to the race if they were. That is to say, he believed that war was not only necessary, but also beneficial, and that a natural system of caste was not only beneficent, but also inevitable. In the demand for universal peace, he saw only a yearning of the weak and useless for protection against the righteous exploitation of the useful and strong. In the demand for equality, he saw only the same thing. Both demands, he argued, controverted and combated that upward tendency which finds expressions in the law of natural selection. In the order of caste, said Nietzsche, is the dominating law of nature, against which no merely human agency will prevail. In every healthy society, there are three broad classes, each of which has its own morality, its own work, its own notion of perfection, its own sense of mastery. The first class comprises those who are obviously superior to the mass intellectually. The second includes those whose eminence is chiefly muscular, and the third is made up of the mediocre. The third class, very naturally, is the most numerous, but the most is the most powerful. So, interesting, Someone like Nietzsche would support a lot of warfare, and he supports it because he believes it strengthens the race. Now, that's something that has been abused by certain neo-pagan elements, at least broadly. I mean, I don't have any quotes from X that I can pull, but I have heard that, you shouldn't be a peacenik. You shouldn't worry about what happens in certain places in the Middle East in respect to certain population groups, because, war is good, and it's something that strengthens the righteous and destroys the weak. And, maybe you should even cheer on certain conflicts because they happen to express the will to power of certain groups and show the inherent inferiority of others. Now, I think if we project this idea into its, if we exhaust this idea and apply it to everything, the entire world would catch on fire and billions of people would die. And I don't think anyone here actually wants that. But, and maybe it's a critique of Nietzsche, but it's something that's worth pointing out. And to an extent, I think it's true. I think a society requires some form of struggle and some form of difficulty in order for it to stay strong. But I don't think warfare necessarily has to be that. Anyone have any thoughts?
Well, this is sort of like my ideological prior speaking here, but this is also why I tend to find that like the knee-jerk expulsion of, say, like the libertarians from the right is somewhat ruinous, is because they are the people that most systematically understand what a peaceful society is supposed to look like, the supposed end goal that the whole right has. And beyond that, they have specific arguments for what creates this peaceful society, keeps it productive, and actually prevents, parasitical elements or people that are inferior in a much broader amoral sense of the word from rising to the top. To my knowledge, I think most fully formulated ideologies under that umbrella term have this idea. But then if I look at, say, post-liberalism, paleoconservatism, or what have you, they all have like specific policies that they talk about implementing every few decades to like fix the country to prevent these things from happening, but they can't explain what makes a society. Is peace good? Is peace the natural state of things, or what have you? They all disagree. So when we're talking about things like warfare, I would very obviously disagree with Nietzsche, but then it's such an absurdity to apply it universally. Number one, as you say, because the world would be on fire. But then number two, I don't think that Nietzsche really talks about like universal imperatives. The warfare would be for a very specific group of people. No.
Yes. No, I agree with what you just said. I think that's a good critique. I just think that certain people on the internet do not think to that level of complexity. So they fall into the trap that I just laid out for them, so to speak. Another thing notable in this quote is, Ryan, am I correct in saying that kind of a right libertarian definition of right wing is an inherent belief in hierarchy? Would you agree with that?
That's like a very broad idea, but yeah, that's a very common one.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think this is why Nietzsche is a right-wing philosopher. Obviously, Nietzsche rubs against a lot of right-wing groups. He's not a nationalist. He's not a Christian. He's a complete moral relativist, and that's very difficult for a lot of right-wingers to accept. But fundamentally, he believed in hierarchy, and hierarchy was the cornerstone of his ideology. This is why Marxist attempts to synthesize Nietzsche into their system have failed constantly. And this is why after World War II, Nietzsche was not converted into a leftist philosopher, which was attempted by a lot of different people. It's just impossible because, fundamentally, he believed in this three-part hierarchy of warriors, intellectuals, and the masses. And that's just fundamentally not left-wing. So that's just another thing I want to bring up that I think is important. Anything to say to that?
Not specifically to say that, because I think the point is well made. But you might want to pick, say, 2 or 3 last quotes, just to sort of start wrapping things up.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. It is. Let's see.
Like we didn't get to women yet. I think that was supposed to be.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do this. Let's talk about women real quick. So, this is a quote. So there's an entire chapter about women. I think you can get this book free online. See if you can find it. And you guys should read this chapter because it's
specifically on Project Gutenberg. It is
excellent.
The philosophy, of Friedrich Nietzsche by H.L. Mencken. You can find it there very easily.
I'm sure will be posted in the comments. But if you're going to read any of the chapters, maybe if you just want to laugh, read this one because it's very funny. But anyways, Nietzsche points out that in the racial economy, the place of women may be compared to that of a slave nation, while the position of man resembles that of the master nation. We have seen how a weak nation, unable on account of its weaknesses to satisfy its will to survive and thirst for power by forcing its authority upon other nations, turns to the task of keeping these other nations as much as possible from enforcing their authority upon it. Realizing that it cannot rule, but it must serve, it endeavors to make the conditions of its servitude as bearable as possible. This effort is commonly made in two ways. First, by essentially renouncing its desire to rule, and second, by attempting to inoculate its powerful neighbors with its ideas in subterranean and roundabout ways, as to avoid arousing their suspicion and opposition. It becomes, in brief, humble and cunning, and with its humility as a cloak, it seeks to pit its cunning against the sheer might of those it fears. The position of women in the world is much the same. The business of bearing and rearing children is destructive to their physical strength, and in consequence makes it impossible for them to prevail by force when their ideas and those of the men happen to differ. To take away the sting of this incapacity, they make a virtue of it, and it becomes modesty, humility, self-sacrifice, and fidelity. To win in spite of it, they cultivate cunning, which commonly takes the form of hypocrisy, cajolery, simulation, and more or less masked appeals to the masculine sexual instinct. All of this is so often observed in everyday life that it becomes commonplace. A woman is physically unable to force a man to do as she desires, but her very inability to do so becomes a sentimental weapon against him, and her blandishments do the rest. The spectacle of a young, strong man ruled by a weak woman is no rare one, certainly, and Samson was neither the first nor last giant to fall before Delilah. And there is scarcely a household in all the world, in truth, in which the familiar drama is not being acted and reenacted day after day. So this is Mencken and Nietzsche's views on women. I think this is a pretty interesting perspective on male and female dynamics within society. I don't really have much to say about it. I mean, I think it's pretty reasonable. Obviously, this is a very unpopular opinion today. I think most people in the OGC would agree with it, but conservative, cowardly conservative circles would disagree with this and tend to drift towards more a, different but equal view of women. I mean, I think there's a Christian theology that pushes such ideas. Complementarianism would disagree with this perspective. But I think this is a more classical perspective of humanity in general. What would you say?
I mean, I find it fascinating that he describes the longhouse as the we on the online spheres have begun to understand it, and of course there are hundreds of different synonym words for different earlier generations that everyone else has grown up with. So the fact that we have so many words to describe this phenomenon sort of betrays an underlying truth that everyone sees this and knows that it's real.
Yes.
It would be,
yes.
You would have to contradict like multiple words that exist in the dictionary to describe this phenomenon in order to say that this actually is not real.
Yes, and maybe you can blame Dionysian civilization for making this worse. Maybe, and Mencken kind of gets at that. I think in the next slide. This one right here that I'm going to read real fast. We can kind of see how our society has hijacked this and maybe made it a bit unpleasant. So here we go. We see about us that women are becoming more and more independent and self-sufficient, and that, as individuals, they have less and less need to seek and retain the goodwill and protection of individual men. But we overlook the fact that this tendency is fast undermining the ancient theory that the family is a necessary and impeccable institution, that without it, progress would be impossible. As a matter of fact, the idea of the family as it exists today is based entirely upon the idea of feminine helplessness. So soon as women are capable of making a living for themselves and their children without the aid of the fathers of the latter, the old cornerstone of the family, the masculine defender and breadwinner, will find his occupation gone and will become ridiculous to force him by law and custom to discharge duties for which there's no longer a need. Wipe out your masculine defender and your feminine parasite, Hausfrau. Where is your family? The tendency is exhibited empirically by the rising revolt against those fetters which the family idea is imposed upon humanity, by the growing feeling that divorce should be a matter of individual expedience, by the successful war of cosmopolitanism upon the insularity and clannishness, and upon all their costly outgrowths of the old idea that men are the same blood, must necessarily love each other, and by the increasing reluctance among civilized human beings to become parents without some reason more logical than the notion of parenthood in itself is praiseworthy. It seems plain, in a word, that so as the considerable portion of women of the world become capable of doing none work and of thus earning a living for themselves and their children without the aid of men, there will be there will be in full progress a dangerous, if unconscious, war upon the institution of marriage. It may be urged in reply that this will never happen because of the fact that women are physically unequal to men, and that in consequence of their duty childbearing, they will ever remain so. But it may be answered to this, they will probably vastly increase their physical fitness, that science will rob childbearing and most of its terrors within a comparatively few years, which of course has happened, and that the woman who seeks to go it alone will have only herself and her child to maintain. Whereas the man of today is not only himself and his child, but also the women. Again, it is plain that the economic hardship of childbearing is greatly overestimated. At most, the business of maternity makes women utterly helpless for no longer than 3 months, and in case of the woman who has 3 children, this means 9 months in a lifetime. It is entirely possible that alcohol alone, not to speak of other enemies of efficiency, robs the average man of quite that productive activity during 70 years and 10. Just for context, I think Mencken was dry. He didn't drink.
I actually don't know that, but that would somewhat
Nietzsche
line up.
Nietzsche didn't drink alcohol, so I wouldn't be surprised. But
Right. This is
so I just thought this was a very
prediction.
Yeah.
It's down to a T.
Yes. And to remind the viewer, this was written probably 119 years ago, I believe. So
yeah, 1908,
what has,
if I remember correctly, is the publication date.
Yeah. So what has occurred, guys?
Like I have been assured by especially a lot of Christian conservatives that Nietzsche is just totally and completely wrong and there's nothing redeeming quality in him. Same with any of his acolytes. But here we have an acolyte of Nietzsche writing about the philosophy of Nietzsche, perfectly predicting the course of the family unit, marriage, divorce, and society at large in the year 1908, just down to the exact logic that it happens. Now, you can, of course, accidentally be correct, but then that's just an accident. The reasoning behind it wouldn't make sense. But here, the reasoning behind it that's being described to us as to why this will happen is what many of us like independently observed. We didn't have to read Nietzsche or Mencken to come to these conclusions. We independently observed these things, and lo and behold, this is what was predicted in 1908.
Yes. Charles, did you have anything to say?
This part at the end here is also funny because you can log into, Twitter at any point, like right-wing Twitter, and see this sort of exact thing happening. Just like scroll through enough of the e-girls in the scene, and you find this thing about, oh, it's so awful childbearing and all of the suffering women have to go through, and they have to sacrifice their whole lives to this, and it's literally exactly what he wrote on the page here is what is currently happening, and I assume it's also been happening literally every day since the beginning of time, basically.
Yes. And I think it's interesting to note, of course, he said that, these women would have children and then abandon the men. And that's kind of what happened in certain communities in the United States for decades. But even today, that's kind of gone away. And what we've seen is that, the population of the United States is just not really having intercourse anymore. They're not hooking up anymore. They're not really having children. Of course, Mencken didn't know birth control would exist, so he had no way of knowing this would happen. But now what we see is 40-year-old cat ladies with kittens instead of babies. So maybe that's kind of the next stage that happens after what is described here. And yeah, I thought this quote was amazing. It amazes me how just having a few good principles can allow you to basically predict the future. But moving on.
So we want to wrap up from government onward. I mean, which things in here should we select? Let's try to not do
government. I'm basically just going to say you could describe Nietzsche as an anarchist, which I found to be very interesting. I've never thought of him like that. And the basic argument of Mencken is that Nietzsche was an anarchist that believed that anarchy would allow the noble aristocratic classes, the people aiming towards the Übermensch, the master class, to rise to the top, and that the slaves would just fall under their control through necessity. That's basically what this is. There's a lot of nuance in it, but that's kind of it. And I think that's an interesting point. And then another interesting point that Mencken makes about Nietzsche is that, there's kind of a common thing to say, like, I think Carlyle said this, if I'm not mistaken. I've never read Carlyle, so I might be mistaken here. But basically, Carlyle identified the industrialist of the modern world to kind of be the great man. And maybe you can compare that to a master morality, Übermensch aiming towards a sort of person. And Mencken would actually argue that Nietzsche did not see it that way. He actually believed that such people like Elon Musk, Donald Trump, J.P. Morgan, etc., would be wiped out very quickly in a truly anarchic land where true masters would come and overtake these kind of fake masters that are propped up by modern society. Take that as you will. I think that's an interesting point. I'm going to skip this quote. We're going to hop to our last few here. More government stuff.
Here, if you had to pick just one to sort of summarize anything we haven't gotten to yet, what would that one be?
Well, I'm gonna wrap this up with a origin of philosophy quote. So Nietzsche believed that introspection and self-analysis, as they were ordinarily manifested, were signs of disease, and that the higher man and Superman would waste little time upon them. The first thinkers, he said, were necessarily sufferers, for it was only suffering that made a man think, and only disability that gave him the leisure to do so. Under primitive conditions, he said, the individual, fully conscious of his power, was ever intent upon transforming it into action. Sometimes this action takes forms of hunting, robbery, ambuscade, which I don't know what that word means, maltreatment, or murder. And other times it appears that those feebler imitations of these things, which alone are accounted by the community. But when the individual power declines, when he feels fatigued, ill, melancholy, or satiated, and in consequence temporarily lacks the yearning to function, he is a comparatively better and less dangerous man. That is to say, he contents himself with thinking instead of doing. So he puts thoughts into words, his impressions of him regarding his companions, his wife, or his gods. Naturally enough, since his efficiency is lowered and his mood is gloomy, his judgments are evil ones. He finds fault and ponders revenges. He gloats over his enemies and envies his friends. In such a state of mind, he turns prophet and so adds to his store of superstitions or devises new acts of devotion or prophecy to the found of enemies. Whatever he thinks, his thoughts reflect the state of mind. His fear and weariness are more than normal. His tendency to action and enjoyment are less than normal. Herein, we see the genesis of the poetic, thoughtful, priestly mood. Evil thoughts must rule supreme therein. In later stages of culture, there arose a caste of poets, thinkers, priests, and medicine men who all acted the same as in early years as individuals who used to act in their comparatively rare hours of illness and depression. These persons led sad and active lives and judged maliciously. The masses perhaps yearned to lead them out of the community because they were parasites, but in this enterprise there was great risk because these men were in terms of familiarity with the gods and so possessed vast and mysterious power. So I'm going to just stop it there. I think that's a very interesting argument, and it's really kind of a fundamental cornerstone of how Nietzsche saw the development of philosophy. I'm not going to get into this too much because it's a lot of complex stuff, but basically Nietzsche believed that before Socrates, who was a 4th century BC Greek philosopher, very famous, before Socrates came about and interrupted the culture of Athens and eventually was executed by the state, the Greek people were fundamentally life-affirming. They were masters. They were a society ruled by masters, and they never asked why. Why do something? Why should we conquer Sparta? Why should we sail to Italy and build a colony? Whatever. Why should we mine silver? They didn't ask those questions. They just did it. And they did it because it expanded their power, and that felt good. And to Nietzsche, that's the ultimate goal of a better society. Whereas when Socrates came about, he overthrew that entire system of thought. And then Plato came about, and Plato built a world of forms, a world that denies physical reality and says, you know what? The physical world, it sucks. What we actually want is we want the world of forms in the sky. We want a world that everything is perfect, everything is beautiful. and it's not here. And what does that really imply? What does it imply when you believe something like that? Well, it implies that you really don't enjoy living in this world. And that's his fundamental argument here. So, anything to say about that?
I mean, is he not describing himself?
No,
like I don't mean that to be a gotcha, because just knowing facts about his personal life, he seemed to have been very troubled and ailed. But like, is this?
So I want to get into that real quick, because I want to wrap up with some context about Nietzsche, his insanity, his disease, etc. So this is a very common talking point that even Christians deploy, and I do not want deployed. There's very good critiques of Nietzsche from a philosophical level, and I think it's bad to describe his physical ailments as something that contradicts his philosophy, and I'll tell you why. So Nietzsche's father died when he was 5, and modern doctors believe that he died of a disease that was basically a genetically inherited tumor in his, like, the front of his brain, and it would push against the back of his eyes. And it pushed so hard and built up so much pressure in his father's head that it killed him. And basically what we believe today is that Nietzsche had the same disease, and it's what killed him. Nietzsche would vomit. At some points, the tumor would push against the back of his eyes so hard that he wouldn't be able to see, and he'd have to just rest all day. Nietzsche was also a person who was injured while he was training for the Franco-Prussian War. He fell off his horse, and he gravely injured himself, and he had to rest for months. He basically tore his chest muscles off of his ribs. It was that bad, and he had to rest for months. So Nietzsche was a person, yes, he was in ill health, but it was it was an ill health caused from attempting to live a sort of vital, fulfilling lifestyle. And it was something that he didn't choose. And that's important because there's a very common myth that Nietzsche had syphilis. The evidence for this is very weak. I don't recall exactly what the original primary source was, but there's some really good YouTube videos online that really dive deep into this claim. And basically there's no basis for it. Did Nietzsche visit brothels? Probably, yeah, especially when he was in the military. But we have no reason to believe he had syphilis. Instead, from descriptions of how he died and the physical ailment that he experienced throughout his life, we believe he had a brain tumor. And that's important because really what we're looking at is a person who wants to live a masterful life but can't due to physical issues that were not of his choosing. Now, obviously, this quote here, maybe that kind of still applies to him because he's a person who's been injured or is tired, just like the person in this quote. But he kind of takes that, and maybe he actually did think that. There's a quote for him where he says that, thoughts of, I don't want to say the S word on YouTube because it might get this taken down or whatever, but thoughts of self-ending are a thing that can get you through the darkest night, which kind of implies that, he was a person who went through very dark times of suicide and depression and stuff like that. And, I think he identified that, and he identified those feelings with this sickness that he had, and he rejected it. And he said, you know what? This is something that's very common in people, and I want to reject it, and I want to overcome it. So I think Nietzsche is very noble for what he tried to do. He was a person, he was so sick, really, he could have lived the rest of his life in a hospital. For much of his life, he was bedridden most of the week. And he basically worked himself to death. I really do believe that for how hard he worked with such physical ailments. But yeah, that's just some kind of context I want to give. As for anything else, the whole horse story, there's a really famous story that Nietzsche, the way he went crazy is that he saw a horse in the streets of Turin, which is a city in Italy, and he saw it getting whipped by his master, and he snapped, and then he beat up the guy whipping the horse and then hugged the horse. There's no basis for this being true. There's no police reports from Italy that said this happened. I think the source for this is a one paper that was written years after Nietzsche died. So there's no evidence for that. I will say one thing, and this is a very controversial thing, And I think it is worth bringing up because it relates to his hatred of Christianity. It may relate to his physical ailments. It relates to how he saw himself and how he maybe saw women. I think there's pretty strong evidence that Nietzsche may have been a homosexual. A lot of people, like gut reaction, get angry when this is brought up, but I really think there's very strong evidence for this. He was really good friends with a gentleman named Franz Overbeck. I believe Franz Overbeck was a Christian historian, which is interesting because obviously you'd think they'd disagree a lot. And they did, but they were still very good friends. And if you read their letters, it's kind of implied that Nietzsche really struggled with a certain a certain constitution and a certain issue that plagued him his entire life. And they would bring it up back and forth a lot. And if you really read between the lines, it's pretty obvious that Nietzsche's talking about being a homosexual. Nietzsche also tended to visit places in Europe. He traveled across Europe his entire life. He never really settled down anywhere. He tended to visit places that had a lot of male brothels, way more than the average part of Europe, and were well known to be places where certain individuals would frequent such places. That's all I'll say about that. And also, it is worth mentioning that Nietzsche tried to marry a woman at one point. So maybe he was a bisexual person, but overall, I think Nietzsche's sexual life was pretty debaucherous. And I think there's pretty good evidence of that. Also, a lot of really famous 20th century philosophers and psychologists also believe Nietzsche was a homosexual. Freud did, for whatever that's worth. I know Freud's not very popular in right-wing circles, but if someone would know that, it would be him because he was a very intelligent person linked to such 19th and 20th century intellectual movements. But I think that's worth bringing up and kind of gives us context of maybe why he was so virulently against Christianity, especially in his later life. He you know, if you read The Antichrist, which is his last book, he really just berates and destroys Christianity to really a somewhat irrational extent. And I think some of that may be his homosexuality. It may also be his childhood, where he was raised by women, very pious women, who abused him mentally in many respects. And he also had a father who died young as a priest. And I think that probably also affected him as well. And I think all these things are worth bringing up. Obviously, you should never dismiss someone's ideas just because of their background, but it's worth knowing their background to maybe understand where these ideas came from and contextualize them. But that's just a spiel, and I wanted to bring that up because there's very common talking points in right-wing circles about Nietzsche.
Yeah, I think that's a very good spiel to end on. I think that certainly if our audience came into this with no understanding of Nietzsche, his ideas, or how they might even possibly relate to anything on the right or in America or what have you, I think they should have a much better idea now. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah. I don't have anything else. Let me just think if there's anything else we're bringing up real fast.
I think that's probably probably enough for now.
Yeah, I don't.
That was a good closing.
We're 25 minutes over.
Yeah.
I just want to say one last thing. I do think it's really notable how H.L. Mencken and Nietzsche are very similar. It's very interesting to me. And obviously, I don't think Mencken was a homosexual or anything. But what I'm saying is, in respect to how each gentleman lived their lives and experienced and had social relationships with other people, I thought it was very interesting. But let's just cut that off. Thank you for having me on, guys. I hope this was coherent to the audience and to you guys. I know I can lather on and maybe go off a little bit, but hopefully this made sense.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Hey, excellent.
Charlemagne, do we have any other things that we should mention?
Yes. Well, we didn't get any supers, although there was a lot of chatter. We did get some subscriptions. One from Wotan005, our first subscriber. Channel membership. We've enabled channel memberships where you can watch the GameSlop streams. Meat Melon 1476, and then Don Browning actually not only bought a membership but gifted two of them. I saw one of them ended up in Sean Weiland's hands. So thanks everyone for buying memberships. And then on the Entropy, we only have one, and it's for $3 from Chesterfield. So thank you. And he actually just has a question about the OGC. He said he got rejected by my local OGC chapter. Can anyone suggest what I should do in a situation like this? Well, basically, the chapters have agency in terms of who they accept or deny. And at the central level, that's actually not within our purview at all. The whole model of the organization is autonomous in that way. So your only options really are to continue talking to that chapter, talk to another one, attempt to found your own chapter, at which point you would then be vetted by the central committee. But yeah, sorry to hear that, but this is something that's really between you and the chapter you were talking to. So yeah, thank you. That's all the super chats and gifts and whatnot. So thank you everyone for sending that in. Reminder: the channel memberships now are live, which will let you see the GameSlop streams. This stream will conclude American Spirits, I guess, season 3. We kind of have loose season definitions here, but I think it's pretty clear that, well, the plan was season 2 ended after this arc we were doing on like the Constitution and Articles of Confederation. Mencken is clearly a season 3, which is now ending. Definitely, the show is probably going to take a bit of a break. I think for sure next week we'll be off. We probably won't be streaming quite as often anymore. We'll see what the next set of things is going to be on American Spirits, but yeah, for now, if we're not streaming every week, don't worry. The show will, appear sometimes at the same time, but we'll definitely be going on a little break before season 4 and beyond. So thank you everyone who's been watching so far.